restrictions being eased in the country that were not operating previously. Relaxation in terms of restrictions on restaurants now being able to operate for sit-down meals, but very importantly to note, a date for the following will be announced that is still yet to be announced to South Africans. So restaurants to operate for sit-down meals, cinemas and theatres to operate with limited gatherings, salons to operate as well, and a date for the resumption of these services is yet to be announced. But most importantly, in terms of compliance, those various industries will need to make sure that they put all the safety measures in place for both the employees and the customers as well. You'd recall, of course, that the salon industry, hairdressers, have been very concerned about the money that has been lost ever since the lockdown itself. And let's stick to that particular issue at the moment. Let's go to the restaurants first of all. The restaurants to operate for sit-down meals, a date for that yet to be announced. I'm joined now on the line by Wendy Alberts, who's the CEO of the Restaurant Association of South Africa. Wendy, very good evening to you. I guess some good news for the restaurant industry this evening.
Yes, what lovely news. I mean, we'd just really like to say thank you to Mr.
All right, we do apologise for that. Wendy Alberts, the CEO of the Restaurant Association of South Africa. We're going to try and get her back on the line again. You would recall that the restaurant industry was very concerned about not being able to operate under lockdown level 3. Part of their argument was that if you would be able to have church services that are operating at no more than 50 people, certainly the restaurant industry would be allowed to have some sit-downs, of course, having some of the protocols themselves observed in terms of social distancing. Wendy Alberts, the CEO of the Restaurant Association of South Africa, joining us now. Them also going to court to challenge government on this particular aspect. One of those as well, you'd recall, the salon industry, hairdressers, the president indicating that 500,000 people in all of these industries, we're talking about restaurants, cinemas, theatres, salons as well, part of those sectors, 500,000 people affected in terms of those who've not been able to earn a living during the particular time when these industries are not allowed to operate. Who's on the line with us at the moment? I think we're going to get the Restaurant Association on the line again. Is that correct from our team? I think so. At this, Wendy Alberts, are you joining us on the line now, the CEO of the Restaurant Association of South Africa? Wendy, are you there?
Thank you, ma'am. We are here. Thank you.
Great. Wendy, sorry, you got cut there a bit. Your reaction, of course, to the president's announcement, a date yet to be announced, but you're going to be able to start operating. Sit-downs are now going to be allowed. Your reaction?
Absolutely. No, we are very, very delighted with the news, and we'd really like to thank the government. We'd like to thank Mr. President for truly acknowledging and truly being sincere and understanding the challenges and hardships of our industry. I mean, we're sitting in an industry that's completely decimated, and the hope that we're bringing our beautiful people back to work and reopening our businesses, bringing life and music back to our businesses. We're bringing hope to restoring and reviving and bringing our beautiful industry and saving our beautiful industry. And we truly thank the Minister of Tourism, Mamaloko, as well as everybody that's been involved in getting the industry open to this point. And to Ashton, our attorney, thank you so much.
Wendy, there's lots of reaction. Very quickly, does this mean that your legal action is now off the cards?
We've got a consultation tomorrow to understand what the norms and protocols are, provided we get our percentage sit down, because we can't decimate the restaurant industry anymore. So we certainly hope that they've heard us to reopen. We certainly hope that they've heard us with the norms and standards document that we put to them in terms of our readiness to reopen in a safe space at a minimum space of around about 60 to 70% of every single outlet.
All right, Wendy, thank you very much indeed for your time. The CEO of the Restaurant Association of South Africa, following President Cyril Ramaphosa indicating, of course, at a date yet to be announced, sit-ins at restaurants will be allowed. Would want to know what the percentage of that is. Now, all of that, I'm sure, is to be outlined. For some analysis, of course, on the President and his address to the nation tonight. Ndumiso Hadebe, who is an economist and director at Pax Africana Holdings, as well as Angelo Fick, who's a research director at the Orwell Research Institute. Very good evening. evening to you both, gentlemen. Angelo, let's start with you. Surprised at all by these particular sectors reopening as the President announced, of course, at a date to be announced at a later stage?
I'm not surprised, but I'm also not necessarily enthusiastic about this, because what this effectively means is that 58 million people who have not necessarily adhered to all of the protocols under the lockdown will now actually have to seriously consider doing so, because responsibility for avoiding infection is now entirely in the hands of 58 million people if they're going to have all of these sectors open. And I think it was the second half of the speech that struck me as far more significant than the first half did.
And Dumiso, let's bring you in there. I know that we're going to have to speed through this, so we've got lots of reaction coming on this. As an economist, is this a step in the right direction, where the President clearly indicating in his address to the nation that we've seen over the past couple of weeks, the number of infections rising rapidly, but you still have him saying now these industries need to open. Your reaction, please.
Indeed, Griselda, I think the question of it being the right or wrong decision is quite relative. But I think in this instance, given the difficulties that many industries in South Africa have faced as a result of the lockdown-induced economic contraction, could not bear the implications of the lockdown any further. And in this instance, we've seen that the most socially vulnerable sectors are indeed the sectors that the President has highlighted today, which contribute about 10.8% to employment in South Africa. And of course, we'd also know that even prior to the lockdown, these are individuals who would be categorized as the most socially and economically vulnerable individuals that have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown. We've also seen that previous to this, the President announcing a number of interventions that are aimed at supporting these particular enterprises, particularly small and medium enterprises. We've seen interventions by the Department of Health, the Health and Welfare SETA, different provincial governments in order to support the impact of this pandemic. However, I think industries such as wholesale and retail, we saw mining in lockdown level 4, which also is a significant employment contributor, and also guys that really are dependent on day-to-day cash flow and revenues in order to sustain their lives. Yeah. Also, given that over 50% of South Africa's population live on just under 900 per person per month.
Angelo, was there any pressure on the President? I mean, you had quite a number of cases go to court where the National Coronavirus Council was being criticised for pushing through irrational decisions. We just heard from the restaurant industry now saying before they decide if they're going to continue with their action or not, they want to understand exactly what this means for them. What capacity would they be able to have back in these restaurants again? You think the President was under immense pressure given some of the litigation?
I think the litigation is part of the larger space in which there was pressure. I think there's also pressure from lobby groups approaching various parts of government outside of the court system. And then there is general pressure from a South African population, because let's not forget this is a capitalist society. And so under the capitalist social system and economic system, people do have to possessively invest in the way in which things work at the moment. And all other forms of imagining solutions to this crisis have simply been set aside and unimagined. So the President was not the only one who felt the pressure. Yeah. Ordinary people felt this pressure on the ground all the time. We've heard from the first day onwards that people felt that they would rather risk their lives, many told us, in order to make money than have to continue to suffer having no income. And it is because we're a society, because we're a world in which there is no guaranteed universal basic income, the only way for people to get money is to participate in activities that they now have to balance out, whether they're Homo economicus or whether they're Homo sapiens sapiens. Do they follow the science and the logic, or do they follow the absolute pressure and need of an economic system that requires of them to take the risks that they do?
But logic is also that South Africa has not yet reached its peak. We're expecting the number of infections in this country to increase rapidly. How does government balance that? And basically what you also said just before we got to this next question about basically all of this being, it's basically up to every single South African now to make sure that they adhere to the restrictions, and basically with no curfew in place, basically a number of the restrictions that we have all fallen away now.
So yes, I think in a society in which you have a stronger social contract and in which you have greater critical literacy, it would be easy to simply expect this to happen. But we don't have that in South Africa. So we have to be very, very careful that we don't simply praise the very repressive measures that were put in place and replace them and imagine that once you take them away, people will simply have learned those habits. I suspect that we will have to work very hard so that, yes, every person must take responsibility for themselves. But in addition to which, those of us who have access to the means and the media and institutions that we do have to start encouraging people to start thinking collective responsibility as well. Because this isn't about whether or not I get to exercise my individual freedom. This is how do we as a society with this threat go ahead to ensure that the maximum number of people are safe from this threat and safe from the larger consequences of this threat. And that, I think, is going to require creative thinking.
Dumiso, with 500,000 people, as the president had indicated, working in these industries where you have these restrictions now relaxed, what are we looking at in terms of the impact to the economy of what you have were industries that were completely not operating?
Sure, Griselda. I think the impact of the lockdown-induced economic contraction is quite severe. I think us ourselves in the office, we've dealt with a number of enterprises, be it franchisees to informal traders, that have come through our doors requesting some significant amount of assistance in respect to the number of jobs that they anticipate to lose, them having received retrenchment letters and them needing cash flow to be able to operate going forward or even to survive. And I think it's quite pronounced, particularly given the high levels of inequality that we have in South Africa, at about 0.6 in South Africa today, and also the fact of the low levels of mobility that particularly folks that come from geographies that have low levels of upward social mobility face in this respect. We would know today that as well, even the South Africans who earned whatever type of income, particularly if they are located outside of centers of economic activity, spend just above 40% of their income on transportation, and if you consider food as well, it shoots up to north of 60%. Now, if you imagine those individuals who no longer had that income, be it them being, for instance, providing daily services such as a plumber, an electrician over the duration of the lockdown, and now, for instance, waiters who earn their income through restaurants, and we know that that particular income is very little. They have been impacted quite significantly. And then you consider restaurants that even before the lockdown, during the second technical recession that we had registered, were very highly geared in terms of their debt levels for whatever reason, and they were really on the verge of collapse. Now, given the lockdown, you might find that the situation is even severe as a consequence of that. So quite a lot has to be done in order to really mitigate the continued effect of the contraction that we experience in South Africa. We've seen also some of the pronouncement that the South African Reserve Bank has also pronounced. But I think going forward, it requires a lot of creativity in terms of what kind of economic systems we design going forward that will work for South Africa to address the levels of poverty, number one, to address the question of employment, and to also address simultaneously the issues related to inequality, because those are the biggest drivers to the status quo in South Africa today, knowing that labor income is the biggest contributor to inequality.
But Dumusa, that does not mean that you'll have these industries recovering anytime soon. Most of them have indicated that they'll only recover next year or even the following year because of the setback of the lockdown and how hard hit it has been for them on this business.
Certainly, the recovery for many industries is not anticipated to be in the short term. If we're being optimistic, we would have to look at something that is in the medium to the long term. But even over and above that, it does require a comprehensive and overhaul of unlocking the long-standing structural blockages that we've had in South Africa for quite some time. And that entails that we even look at the role of the supply side from the side of government in terms of what it has done in the previous part and what has worked and what has not worked, and also looking at what role that the private sector, labor unions, and of course the public in general can do to ensure that going forward, we structure a kind of economy that works for everyone, and particularly that increases the upward social mobility of the most socially and economically vulnerable individuals as a consequence of the lockdown-induced economic contraction, but also because of the long-standing triple threat challenges that we've faced recently.
Angelo, the president speaking about two pandemics here, bringing up the issue of gender-based violence in South Africa, the national discourse very much towards that direction over the past couple of weeks. President saying no fewer than 21 women and children have been killed recently. I mean, all good and well, I guess, for the president to raise that again. It's not the first time he's raising it, but I remember just a couple of hours ago, people asking what happened to, I think it was R1 billion that had been set aside to deal with issues of gender-based violence in South Africa, and that it shouldn't just be lip service.
Precisely, and it is also, the kind of lip service that we're getting from government is sometimes contradictory. You cannot, on the one hand, have senior officials in cabinet and senior officials in the military and police talk about the kind of responses that they did at the start of this lockdown and expect there to be a different kind of understanding of masculinity after the lockdown ends from ordinary South Africans. Also, the femicidal pandemic has been with us for a very long time, so it's not new at all. And to imagine that simply because you've had one pandemic, another one disappears, is not going to happen. And then for me, the third issue is that the pandemic that links these two is the pandemic of inequality. It's not just economic inequality, but social inequality, because while politically on paper women and men are equal in South Africa, it is very much the basis of life chance inequality that results in the possibility of men being able to treat women in the ways that they do. And here I think it's crucial that the president did touch on the spectrum of behaviors on which this kind of femicidal behavior, depends. And that includes everything from the attitudes in our speech patterns when we talk about and to women, the behavior that we have towards them in public. And then what this pandemic has also shown up is that with the absence of income, women who are the most vulnerable economically are themselves secondarily vulnerable to the kind of violence that happens when men are also vulnerable. So there's a complex social matrix out of which this emerges and which we'll have to address beyond merely a return to jobs, a return to business as usual, and a restarting of the economy as it was.
Dumisa and Angelo, please just stay with us. Let's get some more reaction now from political parties. Let's start with the ANC's Pule Mabe, who's joining us on the line. He was, of course, the spokesperson. Mr. Mabe, very good evening to you. Your reaction to President Cyril Ramaphosa's address to the nation tonight?
Well, evening and evening to your viewers. Well, we do welcome the address by the President of the Republic. Of course, dealing with outlining the kind of measures that are being undertaken, as well as talking to the breakthrough that has been made as it relates to the vaccine, but also going on to state the kind of resilience that South Africans have displayed over time. I think one of the things that the President has brought up, which we cannot ignore, is our continued fight against the scourge of gender-based violence, calling on all South Africans to unite and make sure that those that are involved in this act are named and shamed. They cannot be kept in our homes, and we do not alert the police of such men who give men a bad name. But we must also commend the men of our country who have also taken up to social media to organize themselves. There's one group called Act Now, where men have actually came together and began saying, let us start a conversation. What are the things that we as men can do to make sure that those that are giving men a bad name are exposed? This shows the actions, the resilience through which South Africans are willing to attend to the scourge of gender-based violence.
Mr. Mabe, I see a lot of your reaction quite focused on the issue of gender-based violence, but others could argue perhaps that it is your government that is able to do exactly what the President announced in his, or what he touched on in his address tonight, of these criminals who met out this kind of violence against women and children being meted out heavy sentences. It is your government that is in charge. So?
Well, of course, the President has announced the number of measures that the government is already undertaking. I'm sure that the relevant ministries would be able to, whether it's the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Women, they will be able to talk to the kind of measures that they are taking. It is important that we make a rallying call to the rest of South Africa's people to walk this journey with government in the same way that we are working towards dealing with the coronavirus. We called on everyone to stay at home, adhere to the protocols that were pronounced by the World Health Organization, continue to sanitize and do all of that. We have been able to see that with all of that, and the President has said it, that we've been able to at least take down the spike in the cases of the coronavirus pandemic. Of course, our own health system continue to be overloaded. There is a lot of work that people that MECs are doing, including the Minister of Health in various other provinces, making sure that they increase on the number of beds that are there to be able to care for those that need this care, especially during this time. As the President has said, it is quite promising that we will be able to come alive. And the fact that there is more easing to other economic sectors really shows the commitment of our government to ensure that we ultimately return to normality, albeit in a new setup.
All right, Pulemabe, thank you very much, ANC spokesperson. Let's bring in the Democratic Alliance now. John Steenhuisen on the line with us. Mr. Steenhuisen, your reaction to the President's address to the nation tonight?
Well, I think what the President's done, albeit a couple of weeks too late, is to essentially end the lockdown. And I think in doing so has admitted that it's not nearly achieved what it should have done, and it's come at a massive cost to the economy. And I'm surprised he's only realized in this last week just how much damage it's done to industries like the personal care industry and many, many others in South Africa. Fortunately, the opening has come a little bit too late, and what has been baked into our economy now is a very deep economic depression that's going to touch on the lives of many, many, many South Africans and affect their lives as well as their livelihoods going forward. Certainly, the welcoming, the opening up of the economy, it should have happened weeks ago when government's own scientists were telling them to do just that. But unfortunately, I think that for many, many businesses and many, many employees in this country, it's come far too late.
Are you not at all concerned, Mr. Steenhuisen, about the growing numbers of infections and deaths in the Western Cape? And I'm a little bit confused because it seems that you speak from a different tone to reports of your Premier in the Western Cape saying that the opening up of these industries was too premature. Those were some of the reports that we saw. Some clarification, please.
No, well, that was fake news, and the media house that reported as such has already printed a retraction, so it's simply not borne out by the facts, and they published an apology to the Premier for the misquoting. He was speaking about alcohol and alcohol abuse and its effect on the ability for provinces to do so, and that has been a matter of public record, that correction. So there's no two different tones at all. We're absolutely at Edom and have been at the beginning, that you've got to balance in combating this virus, but both lives as well as livelihoods, and that the two are intrinsically linked, and that when you try and separate them, you end up with the problem that we have now, where many, many more South Africans are going to face a really difficult time and a bitter future, because the economy has essentially been wrecked by, I believe, reckless behaviour by government.
All right, John Steenhuisen of the Democratic Alliance, thank you very much indeed for your reaction. Let's go back to our post-analysis here, Mr. Angelo Fiek. We know that we're still in level 3. What does this mean then for the possibility of, level 2? Already when you have so much relaxation of a number of industries, what are we expecting for level 2, Angelo?
So I presume the levels will have to all be brought back into line with the judgment by the High Court of the unconstitutionality of level 4, and that means some rewriting. So presumably level 2 will see interprovincial travel, greater air passenger travel, or who knows what else that's going to be. But I think what must be borne in mind is that this is a disease that we're still learning things about, and so government's responses, as we've seen so far, and our own responses as ordinary people, not just in South Africa, globally, have been full of all sorts of errors that we're going to have to learn from. And so whatever level 2 looks like, there are errors in level 4 and level 3 and in our behavior between the announcement of lockdown on the start of the lockdown on 26 March and now, that all of us will have to learn from in order to improve not just our own individual chances, but the chances of this society to get through this, with greater resilience than we seem to have at the moment. Because resilience is something that we will all require as the deaths mount and as the crises that are not just economic but also social begin to take its toll on individuals, communities, families, and many of the institutions of this society and of the world that we live in.
And Dumuse, let me bring you in there. I mean, if you look at, for example, the restaurant industry, what would possibly work for it in an instance like this? I know it's not yet been outlined, but obviously they're going to have to operate very differently in terms of exactly how many people you're going to allow into the restaurants. That has not been outlined, but how do you think perhaps that should play out in order to keep concerns of many of them not being able to stay afloat, even though they're now being allowed extra leeway?
Well, I think, Griselda, one of the key considerations in relation to this development with respect to the pronouncement by the president today is really a consideration around what are the scientific facts in respect to the increase of what scientists refer to as the R0, which is the basic reproduction number of the new number of infections, and the implications of that in terms of restaurant design and what is the potential impact or transmission in respect to different seating arrangements and so on and so forth. But I think even restaurants as well, depending on how long that they've been operating, they can receive some kind of support in respect to whatever financials that they may have, bank statements and so on and so forth. However, I do think that there's a conversation that we're not necessarily having in depth in respect to the informal economy in South Africa. We've seen that a lot of the interventions that have come through, both from the government-backed loan guarantees and some of the work that private sector players are trying to do, are folks who are not necessarily compliant, who are not registered on CIPC, who do not necessarily have a bank account, and those are the guys that are most socially and economically vulnerable and disproportionately impacted.
Just to interject there, then what happens to the informal economy? Because they're caught on the back foot anyway. So with a bit of leeway in their instance, it doesn't mean anything for someone who is operating in the informal economy.
So in this instance, Griselda, I think it's an opportunity for us to accelerate the much needed interventions that address the information, communication and technology gaps that exist between informal communities and their urban counterparts. This is quite important because if you were to talking about specific transfers and support that goes towards players in the informal economy, that can be done through means of using information, communication and technology. But if there's a disproportionate allocation towards access to those channels, then it makes it difficult even for government or even private sector players or the public in general to be able to transfer those specific interventions of support to the informal economy. And so I think this is an opportunity for us as South Africans to be able to leverage that particular aspect so that even in future, when we prepare for future pandemics, I mean, there's also the question around the impact of climate change in South Africa. And again, it continues to disproportionately affect the most socially vulnerable. When we really address these gaps that have been existing, then it will accelerate our efforts and enhance our efforts to respond much better to pandemics going forward.
I think we've got more reaction now. FF Plus leader Peter Groenewald, are you with us on the line? Very good evening to you.
Good evening.
Good evening. Your reaction, please, to President Cyril Ramaphosa's address tonight.
In our last meeting as political party leaders with the president, I said that the government should change its approach, namely to put certain health protocols in place and then say to businesses, if you can comply to that, then you can open your business. I said to the president that is also self-regulating because any businessman or woman will know that if they can do business by complying to certain protocols, will ensure that they comply to that. I specifically referred to the personal services industry like beauticians and hairdressers. We see some of that approach, but still we need the detail. We want to see what the detail is around the health protocols. Is it practical? And if it is impossible to comply to that, then it is of no use. It must be fair and just. We also say that the question is, why only now? We have to get the date from when that's going to be permitted, because why was it not permitted for the 1st of June? We're still in a level 3. So if we allow it in a level 3 now, and the government is coming with a new word, it's an advanced level 3, but we as the Freedom Front Plus say that it could have been done from the 1st of June, because we must remember, those small businesses, the sole proprietors, every day they're out of business, they're losing money, and it makes it more difficult for them to survive.
Yeah. Let's get more. I beg your pardon. Please continue.
Say again?
Please continue.
We also say that it is quite clear that the pressure is on the government with the court cases coming up, like the court case of the Freedom Front Plus, questioning the constitutionality of the regulations. We also say that it just doesn't make sense. We still didn't hear anything about the cigarette issue, and why didn't we hear about that?
All right, let's leave it there. We've got so much reaction, sir, this evening. Let's move on now to COPE spokesperson Dennis Bloem. Mr. Bloem, a very good evening to you. Let's get your reaction, sir, to the President's address tonight.
Good evening, Criselda. No, we are saying as the Congress of the People all the time that it's between saving lives and saving the economy, a very difficult balance. We are welcoming this opening of some other businesses, but we must also understand it open up the virus more and more. We agree with the president when he's saying that people were sitting without salaries for close to 3 months. It's very difficult. Now, if we look at salaries and we are looking at lives, it's very difficult. But all in all, we appreciate that people must earn a living. They can't. The virus will be with us for a very long time.
All right.
And we must have something to eat.
COPE spokesperson Dennis Bloem, thank you very much for your reaction to the President's address to the nation tonight. Let's go back to Angelo Fiek. Angelo, perhaps others would argue that there wasn't really enough substance, or if I can say meat, that the President added to his speech. There's no clarity on exactly how some of these industries that are now due to operate, how they will operate, at what capacity, what will be allowed, what will not be allowed. And that's what the industries themselves are looking forward to in terms of clarity.
So unless we wanted to sit here for 6 hours and listen to the president outline what those particular things could be, our experience over the last 89 days has been that he will make the rhetorical, symbolic announcement of the larger, sort of, shall we say, policy in which this will happen. And then the various ministers will have individual briefings in which they outline what the regulations are going to be. And those regulations, as everybody points out, are going to be very, very crucial. But that's the bureaucratic element of this. There is the larger issue, which is that the income inequality that predated COVID-19 hasn't gone away. And if we return to that income inequality, this idea that people who return to jobs will somehow magically have the kind of security and certainty that they didn't have before COVID-19 is something that we need to investigate. The choice of profits over people is not one that we can choose. It's not one that we can embark upon without disastrous consequences for us as a society. We know societies in which the profit over people choice has been made. The United States is one of them. where the larger businesses and the conglomerates have been given billions in bailouts and ordinary Americans were given very small amounts of money. The system as it currently works, its institutions are busy failing, and they're not failing because of a government issue. They're failing because they're badly designed for the challenge that they're facing. And in addition to meeting people's hunger requirements, their income requirements, their health requirements, we also have to begin to reinvent almost all of our institutions in the wake of what COVID-19 has taught us. Because, as your other guest has pointed out, there is also the climate emergency, there is the gender-based violence pandemic, there are all sorts of issues that we have to deal with concurrently. We don't have the luxury of simply choosing. And then the last point that I wish to make on this is, once the restaurants are opened, we also have to ask what responsibility those who go to restaurants will have to have. Because if one knows oneself to be ill, one shouldn't go to restaurants, and therefore how does one continue to support people in their livelihood making at these restaurants without putting them at greater risk, if that is the choice you wish to exercise?
Angelo will speak to that, and Dumiso will come to you very shortly. Let's go to the EFF spokesperson now, Vianney Pambo. Very good evening to you. Mr. Pambo, your reaction to President Ramaphosa's address tonight? Mr. Pambo, good evening. Can you hear me?
Good evening, Griselda. Good evening to your listeners. We as the EFF, we note the announcement by the President. We noted with dismay. It is actually very disappointing that the President continues to announce, the easing of the lockdown without scientific backing. He is essentially moving corona from one person to the other. It is important that the President note, as he did when he made the decision that we must go on a lockdown, that, corona is moved by the movement of people. And so if you ease the lockdown without any, decrease in the number of infections, then you're essentially, exposing more people to the danger of getting infected, with the corona. In this instance, we know also that South Africa has not reached its peak. And as a result, we cannot make any decision that, undermines the very efforts that we've put in making sure that we do not spread coronavirus. So it is quite disappointing that the President continues to, make decisions that are favorable for capitalists and not in the interest of people, and not in the interest of...
Maybe I should come in there. I mean, the EFF also champions for black business who have also been caught on the back foot of not being able to operate. Informal business, a part of, the sector that you so largely advocate for, who have been going through hardship since the lockdown started. What about those? Yes, the numbers themselves are increasing, but you have the majority of black people who are still way below the poverty line in this country, who have said we're prepared to go out because we were caught between that, getting the coronavirus, and actually going out to put a plate of food on the table of our loved ones.
Well, I think the government must play an active role in making sure that it cushions the challenges that black businesses are going through, but not only that, to intervene directly to the challenges that our people are struggling with, whether it may be food, as the government has made a decision that there needs to be an unemployment fund. Such decisions must be made in relation to making sure that our people survive. And so it's not an either-or sort of, argument that because we're saying that the economy must not be opened, it means that we're saying that black businesses must struggle. Essentially what we're saying is that first thing that must be considered in every decision that we make must be backed up by science, and that the decision must be made in the interest of human life. And in this instance, we think that the hard hit would still be black people, the people who do not have medical aid, the people who do not have access to health care. And as you have seen, the opening up of, or the unbanning of alcohol sales has actually made hospitals, is to struggle dealing with the number of people who, visit our emergency, or rather who are taken to, the emergency units.
Yes.
Precisely because alcohol, as he has admitted, and we have been saying as the EFF, that it does not assist in the fight against COVID-19. So it is clear that the president has only one interest, and that is the interest of making sure that the economy keeps running, and that economy is a white economy. So it's not true. The opening up of the economy does not serve any black person, especially black people who are struggling with a mere, ability to enter into hospital and get treated with the maximum care that they deserve. In this regard, we think that the easing and opening of the economy without due consideration of science, backed up with scientific research, which assists in making these decisions. Without that, the president is just basically, pleasing his backers. And in this regard, we do not agree with the easing of the lockdown. We think the lockdown should be as strict as possible until at least we've passed, the peak. And South Africa has not hit the peak.
Sure.
And the reality is that there is no one who speaks with authority in regards to COVID-19. And no one really knows what is happening with COVID-19.
Mr. Pambo?
We've actually we're engaging on COVID-19, on speculations, and even the scientists like, Karim, no longer use science to make decisions.
All right, Mr. Pambo, thank you very much indeed for your time, for your reaction to the President's address this evening. Viani Pambo from the EFF. Let's go to the IFP now, spokesperson Mkhuleko Hlengwa. Mr. Hlengwa, very good evening to you. The IFP's response to the President's address tonight?
Well, we certainly don't agree with the easing of the lockdown and the manner in which the President has outlined. There are glaring contradictions in what the President has had to say tonight. Amongst other things, he speaks about the shortage of testing kits. On one hand, he puts out there that some South Africans are not complying with even the basic precautionary measures, but yet on the other hand, we continue to increase the traffic of the movement of people in social spaces. That in itself is cause for concern. Secondly, the easing of this lockdown comes at a time when we are still grappling with the realities of its impact insofar as schools, for example, are concerned, and we have not made a full sense of what that means and what the implications thereof are. The third aspect, of course, is the fact that the President is speaking at a time when the ban on alcohol has been lifted, and it's quite clear that has had a negative and adverse effect to the efforts that are being made to try and flatten the curve. It's therefore the IFP's view that the easing of the lockdown and the manner in which the President has outlined has certainly been premature and calls into question the collective integrity of the process that has been followed, because it's clear here that political considerations took precedence over healthcare realities, and that in itself therefore means we have fallen short of pushing back on the frontiers of this virus. All right.
Mr. Hlengwa, thank you very much indeed for your time. The IFP responding to the President's address this evening. Let's go back for some of that post-analysis. And Dumiso Hadebe, economist and director at Pax Africana Holdings, as well as Angelo Fika, research director at Owl Research Institute. Dumiso, one of the issues that you were touching on before we went to that political reaction was the impact that has been felt by the informal economy in South Africa.
Indeed, Criselda, and I think it's quite important because given the political commentary that has also just come forward and my fellow panelists, there's a lot of there's a difference in terms of how we're conceptualizing what needs to be done, and quite rightly so, because there's still a lot that we don't know regarding the virus. It's a new pandemic, and we are trying to learn from history and what previous pandemics shaped and looked like, and how we can better respond to this one. But I think even when we think about the economy and what we need to do in responding to the economy, it's important that we not create this abstract idea about the economy, that the economy is a foreign concept that is not close to us. But the economy is indeed driven by economic agents. And one of those most important economic agents in the driving an economy is people. And so in our response or conceptualizing a response to the COVID-19 pandemic to the South African economy, i.e. the main economic agents being people, we need to think about it from the perspective of public health. We need to think about it from the perspective of poverty, of inequality, and then being able to also self-actualize and be rewarded for whatever opportunities they might try to leverage. And so those are the important trade-offs and important balancing act that we need to consider when we do so. But in addition to that, we also need to consider the basis from which these different people i.e. economic agents, are coming from, and the resultant implications of a particular support or intervention as it relates to these various levels of the lockdown, and ultimately the overall impact on the well-being and the stability and the sustainability of the South African economy going forward. And so I think it's important that we add that perspective when we conceptualize issues around the economy.
Angelo, just before we wrap up, this government itself being caught between a rock and a hard place, in that it was not going to be sustainable to be able to ensure that everyone who needs assistance will be assisted, especially as we see the numbers of infections increase and more industries now, government forced to reopen these industries.
So I think the South African state as a whole was not best placed to respond to this particular crisis because of what the conditions were like prior to March 26th. And it is, I think, really kind of magical thinking to imagine that simply because we've had 89 days, the state will somehow have improved. Yeah. And it's not just because of the consequences of political decisions, but our institutions as a whole, and this is global, this is not just South African, this is transnational, are ill-equipped to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. That something as invisible and to the naked eye as a microbe can lead to this kind of chaos tells you how weak the system is. The crises and challenges that were being prepared for included war, disaster of a different kind. And here we have something that spread very, very quickly and has had a huge impact, not just locally, but globally. And how we as a civilization, how we as a species respond, and how we change our institutions, not just reinvest them with the kinds of structures that we've had before, but realize which are failing and how many will have to be reinvented altogether and overhauled. And that includes the economy, education, the health sector. All of this will have to shift over the next generation if we are to survive into the second half of the century with anything of a semblance of civilization that we have at the moment.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all the time that we have this evening. Thank you very much for staying on the line with us as we waited, of course, for the President to address the nation, and, of course, your post-analysis of what the President has told us this evening. Ndumiso Hadebe, who's an economist and a director at Pax Africana Holdings, as well as Angelo Fique, who's research director at the Orwell Research Institute. Also, the new numbers are in. I see on your screen there confirmed COVID-19 cases in South Africa at 80,412. Those are just some of the latest numbers that were coming in. You'll see in just as the other programs continue here on the SABC News channel, updates as well in terms of recoveries as well as the deaths in the country. So stay tuned here to the SABC News channel. We'll have a lot more unpacking of that certainly as the evening progresses. But African Perspective, I do believe, is up next. Aldrin St. Pierre will join you then, but from an extended version of The Full View. Thank you very much for watching. Good evening.